Picture this. You wake up each morning believing you're the author of your choices, the captain of your consciousness. Yet throughout the day, you find yourself reacting in ways that surprise you. Drawn to certain people, repelled by others, making decisions that seem to emerge from somewhere deeper than rational thought. What if I told you that beneath the surface of your conscious mind lies a vast, ancient intelligence? A psychological inheritance from every human who has ever lived, carrying both wisdom and shadow, guiding and sometimes misguiding your every step. Welcome to the profound world of Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist who dared to map the uncharted territories of the human psyche and discovered that becoming your true self is perhaps the most radical act of courage you'll ever undertake. Jung understood something revolutionary. We are not simply rational beings making conscious choices. We are complex ecosystems of consciousness, carrying within us layers of experience, memory, and potential that extend far beyond our individual lives. Imagine your mind as an iceberg. The small tip visible above water represents your conscious awareness, your everyday thoughts, your deliberate decisions, your carefully crafted persona. But beneath the surface lies something magnificent and mysterious, the vast, unconscious realm that actually shapes most of your psychological reality. This isn't merely a metaphor. Jung discovered through decades of clinical practice and deep self-exploration that our unconscious minds contain both personal material, forgotten memories, repressed emotions, unrealized potentials, and something even more remarkable: collective patterns inherited from our species' psychological evolution. Carl Gustav Jung emerged into this world in 1875 in Switzerland. Born to a family marked by both spiritual intensity and psychological complexity. His father was a pastor wrestling with faith. His mother was a woman who claimed to see spirits, spending long periods lost in her own mysterious inner world. Jung's childhood reads like a preparation for his life's work. An intensely introverted child, he spent countless hours alone, engaging in elaborate fantasies, carefully observing the adults around him, learning early that the outer world often masked deeper, more complex realities. School became a source of profound anxiety, so much so that he would faint to escape it. Yet this apparent weakness contained a hidden strength. Jung was learning to pay attention to his inner landscape, to the subtle energies and unconscious processes that most people ignore. When he finally channeled this introspective nature into his education, studying medicine and eventually psychiatry, Jung brought a unique perspective to the field. While others focused on symptoms and disorders, Jung was fascinated by the deeper patterns, the archetypal structures that seem to govern human experience. In 1907, Jung met Sigmund Freud, and their first conversation lasted 13 hours straight. Imagine the intellectual electricity of that encounter, two brilliant minds recognizing kinship, yet carrying within them the seeds of profound disagreement. For several years, they traveled together, analyzed each other's dreams, developed psychoanalytic theory as a collaborative art. Freud saw in Jung a worthy successor. Jung found in Freud an intellectual father figure. Yet this very dynamic contained its own destruction. Jung's mind moved in directions that Freud's scientific materialism couldn't accommodate. Where Freud saw sexual energy and childhood trauma as the primary drivers of human psychology, Jung perceived something far more expansive: a spiritual dimension, a collective inheritance, a purposeful unfolding of consciousness that couldn't be reduced to biological drives. The break came in 1913, and with it, Jung descended into what he would later recognize as his most important psychological journey: a voluntary encounter with his own unconscious that would reshape his understanding of human nature forever. From 1913 to 1918, Jung deliberately opened himself to the contents of his unconscious mind. He engaged in what he called active imagination, a practice of allowing unconscious images, fantasies, and energies to emerge into consciousness without judgment or control. This wasn't madness. It was methodical exploration. Jung was conducting the most important research of his career, mapping the geography of his own psyche to understand the universal principles that govern all human consciousness. During this period, he encountered what he would later call the collective unconscious, that layer of psyche that contains the accumulated wisdom and patterns of our species. He discovered that certain images, symbols, and themes appeared not only in his own inner work, but also consistently across his patients, across cultures, across historical periods. Jung was uncovering what he would name archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that shape our perceptions, relationships, and life trajectories in ways we rarely recognize consciously. Jung's model of the psyche represents one of psychology's most sophisticated understanding of human consciousness. Rather than seeing the mind as a simple conscious-conscious duality, Jung recognized multiple layers, each serving essential functions in the economy of psychological life. At the surface lies consciousness, your everyday awareness, centered around what Jung called the ego. The ego creates continuity in your sense of self, weaving your experiences into a coherent narrative of identity. It's the part of you that says, "I am," and maintains consistency across time and circumstance. But the ego, Jung discovered, often creates a false self, what he called the persona. The persona is the mask we wear in social situations, the character we present to gain acceptance, approval, or advantage. While necessary for social functioning, the persona becomes problematic when we mistake it for our true identity. Beneath consciousness lies the personal unconscious, a repository of forgotten memories, repressed emotions, and unrealized potentials specific to your individual experience. This layer contains what Jung called the shadow, all those aspects of yourself that your ego does not want to acknowledge or integrate. But Jung's most revolutionary insight concerned an even deeper layer, the collective unconscious. This realm contains archetypal patterns inherited from humanity's psychological evolution, universal themes that manifest across cultures and throughout history. Consider how certain stories captivate us universally: the hero's journey, the wise mentor, the great mother, the trickster, the divine child. These aren't arbitrary cultural inventions. They're expressions of archetypal patterns hardwired into human consciousness, shaping our perceptions and experiences in profound ways. Perhaps Jung's most challenging insight concerns what he called the shadow, the repository of all those aspects of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or simply never acknowledged. The shadow contains not only our potential for evil or destructiveness, but also many of our unrealized capabilities and authentic desires. Here is what makes shadow work so difficult. The very act of maintaining a positive self-image requires continuous psychological effort to push unwanted qualities out of conscious awareness. We project these qualities onto others, seeing in them the traits we refuse to recognize in ourselves. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This isn't merely philosophical poetry, it's practical psychology. Until we consciously acknowledge our capacity for selfishness, cruelty, irrationality, and pettiness, these energies operate autonomously, influencing our behavior in ways we don't understand or control. Shadow integration doesn't mean acting out destructive impulses. It means developing conscious relationship with the full spectrum of human potential within yourself. When you can honestly acknowledge your capacity for jealousy, you're less likely to be unconsciously driven by it. When you can admit your need for recognition, you can pursue it more skillfully. The shadow also contains positive qualities we view rejected because they did unfit our self-concept or social conditioning. Perhaps you learned early that creativity was impractical, so you buried your artistic impulses. Perhaps you were taught that sensitivity was weakness, so you armored your heart against feeling. Shadow work often involves reclaiming these exiled aspects of authenticity. Within each person, Jung recognized, exists both masculine and feminine psychological energies, regardless of biological gender. The anima represents the feminine qualities within a man's psyche. The animus represents the masculine qualities within a woman's psyche. The anima might represent receptivity, intuition, emotional attunement, connection to the unconscious. The animus might represent focused action, logical analysis, goal-directed behavior, conscious discrimination. This isn't about gender stereotypes, but about psychological functions that transcend cultural definitions of masculinity and femininity. A man who has no conscious relationship with his anima may struggle with emotional intelligence, creativity, or meaningful relationships. A woman who has no conscious relationship with her animus may struggle with assertiveness, clear thinking, or achievement in the outer world. You begin to question the values and beliefs you inherited unconsciously. Jung understood these dark nights of the soul not as pathology, but as necessary passages in psychological development. You start noticing the gap between your persona and your authentic desires. Unlike passive fantasy, active imagination involves consciously engaging with the images, figures, and scenarios that emerge from the unconscious. The images and insights that emerge often carry genuine wisdom about your psychological situation. You might visualize descending into an underground chamber and exploring what you find there. You might personify an emotion, perhaps anger or sadness, and ask what it needs from you. It's a way of befriending your unconscious rather than being unconsciously driven by it. You become curious about your own psychological patterns rather than simply being driven by them. Dreams often point toward unexplored potentials or indicate where conscious development is needed. This isn't self-improvement in the conventional sense. It's a process of uncovering and integrating your authentic nature. The archetype of the wounded healer suggests that our deepest wounds often become sources of wisdom and compassion, both for ourselves and others. Your history of relationship difficulties might cultivate deep understanding of human complexity. Your struggles with addiction might generate powerful insights about the nature of craving and attachment. If you're stuck in indecision, your dreams might present clear symbols of direction. If you're inflated with your own importance, your dreams might humble you with images of vulnerability or limitation. This doesn't mean becoming superstitious, but developing sensitivity to the poetic, symbolic dimension of experience. The goal isn't to eliminate psychological difficulties, but to develop more conscious, skillful ways of working with them, rather than choosing between opposing forces within yourself. The transcendent function finds a third way that honors both sides while moving beyond their conflict. By maintaining awareness of both sides of an internal conflict without immediately choosing sides, you create space for novel solutions to emerge from the unconscious, perhaps developing portable skills that allow you to work from anywhere or creating adventures within the structure of a stable life. You become more authentically yourself, not by eliminating contradictions, but by learning to hold them consciously. Notice when you're operating from persona versus authenticity. Pay attention to what triggers strong emotional reactions in you, recognizing these as potential shadow projections. Practice active imagination during quiet moments, allowing images and insights to emerge without forcing particular outcomes. Individuation isn't a project to be completed, but a lifelong process of deepening, self-understanding, and authentic expression. Synchronicities often appear during periods of psychological transformation, as if the unconscious is communicating through the language of outer events. Individuation requires ongoing practice, continuous attention to your inner landscape, and willingness to question your assumptions about yourself and reality. Solutions often arrive as images, metaphors, or sudden insights that couldn't have been reached through rational deliberation alone. You must be willing to see yourself clearly, not as you wish you were or as others expect you to be. These might manifest as thinking of someone just before they call, encountering the same symbol repeatedly during a period of transition, or having outer events mirror inner psychological processes. For Jung, dreams serve a compensatory function, balancing one-sided conscious attitudes by presenting alternative perspectives. But as you actually are, with all your contradictions, limitations, and unrealized potentials, Rather than imposing intellectual interpretations, he suggested entering into relationship with dream imagery through reflection, artistic expression, or active imagination. Healthy psychological development requires integrating both sets of qualities. Jung understood that psychological wholeness emerges not from choosing sides in some internal gender war, but from developing conscious access to the full spectrum of human capabilities within yourself. Jung called the process of psychological development individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you actually are beneath all your conditioning, defenses, and social adaptations. Individuation requires what Jung considered the most challenging psychological work: radical self-acceptance and radical self-acceptance. This process unfolds differently for each person, but certain themes appear universally. Individuation often involves periods of confusion, depression, or anxiety as old structures of identity dissolve and new ones slowly emerge. One of Jung's most practical contributions to personal development is the technique of active imagination, a method for dialoguing directly with unconscious contents. You might imagine having a conversation with a recurring dream figure, allowing it to speak and responding authentically. The key is maintaining what Jung called dual consciousness, remaining aware that you're engaging in imagination while simultaneously taking the process seriously. Active imagination bypasses the ego's censorship mechanisms, allowing you to access information and perspectives that purely rational analysis can't reach. Jung revolutionized dream interpretation by moving beyond Freud's emphasis on wish fulfillment and hidden desires. If you're overly identified with your rational, analytical side, your dreams might emphasize emotional or intuitive content. Jung encouraged approaching dreams not as problems to be solved, but as communications from a wiser part of yourself. The goal isn't to decode dreams like cryptic messages, but to allow their symbolic language to enrich your understanding of your current psychological situation. Jung understood that psychological development doesn't lead to perfection, but to wholeness, and wholeness includes imperfection. Your struggles with depression might develop extraordinary sensitivity to others' suffering. This does unromanticize suffering, but recognizes that conscious relationship with our wounds can transform them into sources of strength and service. Jung's concept of wholeness embraces paradox, strength and vulnerability, confidence and humility, independence and connection. One of Jung's most intriguing contributions is his concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to indicate some underlying pattern or intelligence operating beyond rational causation. Jung didn't propose synchronicity as supernatural phenomenon, but as indication that psyche and world are more intimately connected than our usual subject-object consciousness recognizes. Paying attention to synchronicity cultivates what Jung called symbolic attitude, a way of perceiving that recognizes meaning and pattern beyond literal, causal thinking. Perhaps Jung's most sophisticated insight concerns what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to generate creative solutions that transcend apparent contradictions. For example, if you're torn between security and adventure, the transcendent function might reveal a path that incorporates both. This process requires holding tension consciously rather than rushing toward premature resolution. The transcendent function operates not through logical analysis, but through symbolic, intuitive processes. Understanding Jung's psychology intellectually is quite different from living it. Begin by developing what Jung called objective consciousness, the capacity to observe your own psychological processes with curiosity rather than judgment. Keep a dream journal, not necessarily to analyze every symbol, but to maintain dialogue with your unconscious. Most importantly, approach this work with patience and self-compassion. Jung's insights extend far beyond individual therapy into understanding collective psychological dynamics. The same archetypal patterns that operate in personal psychology also shape group behavior, cultural movements, and historical processes, or how social movements often follow mythological patterns of death and rebirth, sacrifice and renewal. Understanding these dynamics does introduce complex social phenomena to simple psychological formulas, but provides additional perspective on human behavior at scale. Consider how certain political leaders embody archetypal energies that resonate with collective psychological needs. As more people become conscious of their own shadow projections, stereotyping and scapegoating decrease. Anxiety might signal that the psyche is preparing for necessary but challenging growth. Even more severe symptoms like psychotic episodes might represent breakthrough attempts that require skillful support rather than simple suppression. But it recognizes that external change without corresponding internal development often recreates the same problems in new forms. The first half typically focuses on ego development, establishing identity, achieving goals, adapting to social requirements. Jung understood this not as pathology, but as natural psychological development, calling you toward deeper authenticity and service. But around midlife, deeper questions emerge about meaning, authenticity, and spiritual purpose. This might involve mentoring younger people, engaging in creative expression, or pursuing spiritual development. As individuals integrate their anima and animus, gender-based conflicts become less polarized. Jung believed that individual psychological development contributes to collective healing. Digital platforms can facilitate dream sharing, active imagination groups, and global communities organized around consciousness development. The more conscious you become of your own psychological patterns, the less likely you are to be manipulated by algorithmic systems designed to trigger unconscious reactions. The same technologies that can fragment awareness can also support integration when used skillfully. It means approaching your own psychology with scientific curiosity rather than dogmatic beliefs about who you should be or how you should develop. While you must do the inner work yourself, you need community, mentorship, and relationships that support authentic development rather than persona maintenance. Rather than rushing toward premature answers about the meaning of existence or the nature of authentic living, Jung encouraged maintaining openness to ongoing discovery and development. How can I contribute to collective healing through my own psychological development? What wants to emerge through my particular configuration of gifts and limitations? This doesn't minimize the importance of addressing systemic issues through political and social action. You need only willingness to pay attention to your inner landscape with the same curiosity and respect you might bring to exploring a foreign country. Each integration of shadow material reveals new aspects requiring attention. You are simultaneously the scientist studying human consciousness and the experiment itself. You are both the cartographer mapping psychological territory and the landscape being explored. This guidance speaks through dreams, synchronicities, emotional reactions, creative impulses, and the quiet voice of authentic knowing that emerges when you create sufficient stillness to listen. Each moment of authentic expression uncovers further potentials waiting to be explored. And willingness to question everything you think you know about yourself. The question is whether you have time not to do it. For in the end, Jung reminds us, consciousness is the only gift we can truly offer to the world, and becoming conscious is the task that gives meaning to our existence. Yet this demanding path offers proportional rewards, the possibility of living with genuine authenticity, contributing meaningfully to the collective healing our world desperately needs, and participating consciously in the ongoing evolution of human consciousness. We can craft carefully curated identities while remaining unconscious of our authentic desires and fears. We can project our unconscious contents onto public figures and political movements with unprecedented intensity. It's present right now, beneath the layers of conditioning and defense. Available in this moment through your willingness to meet yourself with radical honesty and compassion. One of Jung's most controversial insights concerned the relationship between psychological disturbance and spiritual development. From this simple beginning, Jung suggests everything else naturally unfolds. Every relationship becomes an opportunity to recognize projections and practice authentic communication. Every emotional reaction becomes a chance to explore unconscious contents. every decision becomes a moment to choose between persona and authenticity. The speed and complexity of modern life often overwhelm our psychological processing capacity, leading to what Jung might have recognized as collective neurosis. He noticed that many psychological symptoms, when approached with proper understanding, contain seeds of potential growth and transformation. Depression might indicate that old structures of identity are dissolving to make way for new development. Rather, it suggests approaching psychological difficulties with curiosity about their potential meaning and function, rather than viewing them purely as problems to be eliminated. This perspective doesn't romanticize mental illness or discourage appropriate treatment. Jung often worked with people whose psychological crises were simultaneously spiritual emergencies, periods of intense transformation that required both psychological support and recognition of their deeper significance. Jung noticed that psychological development follows different patterns in the first and second halves of life. This transition often manifests as midlife crisis, a period of questioning everything you've built and achieved. The second half of life requires developing what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to find meaning beyond literal achievement and accumulation. Rather than continuing to build ego strength, the second half of life calls for what Jung termed ego relativity, maintaining healthy ego function while recognizing larger purposes and patterns that transcend individual will and desire. Although Jung died in 1961, his insights seem increasingly relevant to our current technological moment. Social media creates unprecedented opportunities for shadow projection and persona inflation. Yet technology also offers new tools for psychological development. Jung's emphasis on individual psychological responsibility becomes even more crucial in an era when collective unconscious contents can spread instantaneously through digital networks. Jung often quoted the poet Rilke's advice to live the questions. This requires developing comfort with uncertainty, paradox, and the unknown. Living the questions also means recognizing that individuation is not a solitary process. The questions Jung invites us to live include: who am I beneath my social conditioning? What aspects of myself have I rejected or never explored? Perhaps Jung's greatest gift lies not in his complex theoretical formulations, but in his recognition that profound psychological and spiritual development happens through engaging consciously with ordinary experience. You don't need dramatic spiritual experiences or therapeutic breakthroughs to begin individuation. The sacred emerges through conscious engagement with the details of your daily experience. How you respond to frustration, what you notice in moments of beauty, how you relate to your own limitations and those of others. Carl Jung's exploration of human consciousness reveals individuation not as a destination, but as a way of traveling. Each layer of self-understanding opens onto deeper mysteries. This isn't frustrating incompletion, but endless fascination. Jung's work suggests that becoming your true self requires everything you have to give. Your courage, curiosity, patience. The navigation system Jung discovered operates not through external GPS, but through developing intimate relationship with your own inner guidance. Your true self isn't waiting somewhere in the future to be discovered. The journey of individuation begins with a single step: the decision to pay attention to who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. The question isn't whether you have time for this work.